Welcome. Last week, we spent a little bit of time looking at the important topic of experiments and experimental research. And in particular, we talked a little bit about the value of doing experiments from the perspective of psychologists, but also a number of the ethical considerations that go into what makes for not only an effective experiment, but also one that is admirably and safely conducted. One of the things that we left off with in terms of that set of lessons was a fairly interesting study of an important experiment run in 1971 by Philip Zimbardo. And the experiment, of course, was the Stanford Prison Experiment. In that particular experiment, Zimbardo set up a mock prison within the basement of Stanford University, and a group of about 30 or so university students were invited to play either the role of prisoner or prison guard. And the question, of course, was how would these roles impact people? What would be, I guess, the psychological result of putting people within a prison like setting? For the next week or so, we're going to extend the look that we took at the prison system within that particular experiment to a broader investigation where we're going to start to look at the actual or real prison system that's used in Canada and other parts of the world, particularly in North America. And what we're going to be looking at over this week long sort of investigation is a few things. First of all, we are going to consider the psychological impact of prison on the people who are, of course, incarcerated there. But we're also going to think about the sociological questions of what should a prison look like, what should be the primary goals for a prison, and finally, are people, and you'll notice there's 40,000 or more people in Canada who are currently in some form of prison like institution. Are we setting those institutions up in a way that actually is benefiting not only the prisoners, but also the society that spends a huge sum of money in order to try to provide justice through those means? When you're talking about prison, it's worth noting that prison is not necessarily the only result that can occur when a person commits a crime. And in fact, to understand how a person ends up in prison, you have to look back a little bit to just how does a person end up in the criminal justice system. The beginning to the justice system, of course, what occurs when a crime is committed. And the first group or institution that's responsible for dealing with crime would be the police. The police would look for evidence, try to determine what happened, and then hopefully, if they have enough evidence and they have a person that they can link that evidence to, they will charge a person who will then end up within the court system. Actually, the vast majority of people who commit crimes don't even have a trial. Most people who commit crimes probably realize that the trial would lead to a guilty verdict. They may not want to risk the time, the sort of mental fatigue that a trial represents, and they may want a favorable deal in terms of what happens as the outcome of a trial. And so they may actually plea. And what happens is that they say they're guilty, the trial is sort of pushed to its end conclusion, and then things are handed off at the end. Some people may actually feel like they have a legitimate argument or defense. They may actually go to a trial. Those can involve either just a judge or sometimes, if it's a major crime, a jury as well, looking at the evidence, determining whether or not there's enough beyond a reasonable doubt to actually say that the person is guilty. And if there is, then you have a guilty individual. If there's not, they're declared not guilty and they go free. By the way, worth pointing out, a person is never innocent. You're either guilty or not guilty. But not guilty, unless there's enough evidence to beyond a reasonable doubt convict you, it will mean that things are at the end of the line. If you get a guilty verdict, though, and if you have a situation where a person has pled guilty and sort of given up on the right to a trial, in both those cases, now you have to decide what will happen to that particular individual. And that means that a judge, and it's always a judge in Canada, has to decide what should we do with this guilty person. We talked a little bit about this in class, so I won't spend a lot of time on this particular slide going over things. But do understand that for judges, and by the way, just a little bit of an aside point, in Canada, judges don't actually wear wigs. That's a British tradition. We do maintain the British tradition of a gown because a lot of our criminal law comes from Britain and always sort of has had those roots. But they don't actually wear wigs here. Only judges in countries from, like, for example, the UK do. Anyways, going backwards. If you're a judge, you have to decide what to do with the person. And there are a number of considerations, and it's not always easy to balance those because they don't always necessarily blend or go together well. The four key sentencing goals to review are first and foremost to punish the offender. We term that retribution. It's an old fashioned notion of justice, that justice is achieved through making a person pay for their crime. One of the oldest legal, I guess, documents ever was the Code of Hammurabi, which is an ancient legal code from Babylon, a very early ancient civilization in modern day Iraq. And within that document, as I mentioned, the eye for an eye principle was one of the core sort of tenets. And for years and years, thousands of years since, punishment has been a key goal that people have looked for, particularly violent crime. Other considerations, of course, would be to protect the public. A part of what you need to do with a sentence is to make sure that that person who's committed a crime is not a risk to commit again or to hurt other people. You also want to have something that's significant enough that people won't keep committing those acts because, of course, they're not good for society. So deterrence has to be considered. And finally, you have to consider, and this can be the most difficult of all to blend with the first three, you have to consider the need to rehabilitate. And you have to question yourself in terms of how can you make it so that this person who's probably, unless it's something like first degree murder, going to go back into society at some point. How can you make it so that this person can actually function again when they do go back or re enter into society? And how can you make sure that the sentence provides for those sorts of psychological needs? There are practical considerations as well that, of course, underlie all of the decisions you make. Cost, what kinds of resources do you have? What are the needs of the victim in the community? It's safe to say that, in short, sentencing is not an easy thing to do, and certainly for judges, it's probably one of the most difficult tasks within the criminal justice system that they have. When you're looking at prisons, not everybody ends up in prison. In fact, the vast majority of people who commit crimes, especially minor petty crimes, they may see other options in terms of what's done for them. Fines, probation, community service, uh, mandatory counseling, home arrest. I've only listed a few of the options. There's a lot of different things that can be added to a sentence, and sometimes you can actually mix and match and give a combination of the things that are on that list and beyond. In the situations, however, where you have significant crime, whether it's either violent or something that's a significant damage or represents a significant damage to society and that requires a heftier penalty, prison will certainly be part of the equation. Um, People differ, and you're going to see this in our discussion over the next couple of days. People differ a lot in terms of their beliefs about how prison should look, what it should try to achieve, how it should function. But there is at least an understanding that's universal in almost all societies that prison needs to at least be there. And certainly some of the time, it's going to be a required option. In Canada, we've had prison really as long as Canada's been a country. In fact, even in the years before, of course, prisons were a thing. As you can see here, and I've got this up on the screen, 1839 was the first date for our first major prison in the country, and it was located in Kingston, Canada. If you go to Kingston, which of course is the city that has Queen's University, they recently closed the penitentiary there, but you can still see it. It's still a fairly significant landmark, especially in terms of the archaeology and just its sort of placement within the core part of the city. Certainly, it is an echo of the fact that prison has always had an important role of Canada within Canada, and is something that, of course, to this day we maintain as something that's significant. Since they built that, they've built many other facilities. They vary in terms of what kinds of security, what kinds of options for programming for prisoners they offer. Different prisons for different kinds of people. But the key part is that with 40,000 people, or key detail, with 40,000 people, obviously you need a place to put them, and there's lots of those places that exist within Canada today. Um, Canada is often perceived to be a very safe country, and so that may lead you to believe that we probably don't have as many people in prison as other places. And to a certain extent, that is true. Certainly, and I'll show you some statistics in a second, the United States is by far more populated in terms of its prisons per capita than Canada would be. In fact, they're way ahead of every country in the world. It may surprise you to note, though, that we do actually in Canada use prison quite a lot. And if you actually compared Canada to other parts of the world, you'll actually see that we're in the higher upper echelon of countries in terms of our incarceration rates. That's the number of people who are in prison per capita for the population. And there's a lot of debate in terms of, is that something that's ideal? Okay, and certainly that's a question we'll ask a little bit over the next couple of days and some of the lessons you're going to be exploring. Should we be using prison as much as we are, or is it perhaps a mistake? And are there other options that would better serve the community and better serve sort of the basic tenets of justice. Here you can see a picture of just incarceration rates. Now, I've excluded the United States because they'd be way off the picture. You can see that they're 698. I forget what that is, but they're quite high. Canada kind of comparatively high if you look at like some other parts of Europe, but not overwhelmingly so. Here's another example, and I actually do have the statistics I can read out there. This is per 100,000 people, how many people are in prison. United States would be 716. That's about a 10-year-old graph, but it's sort of similar today. That's quite literally almost 1 in 1,000 people. Whereas if you look at a country like Canada, it's closer to one in 10,000. And certainly you can see that our numbers are quite a bit lower. And they're a little bit high compared to some parts of Western Europe, but at least compared to the United States, they're a little bit more moderate. And that's just a graph that shows you how prison population has skyrocketed over the last 30 or 40 years. And part of that has actually been a product of society. Okay? And in fact, we'll look at that debate. Has there been too much of a get tough on crime sort of movement in terms of public policy? There's a lot of debate for and against, but certainly in the United States, it's one of the most pressing social questions that are wrestled with by sociologists, psychologists, and others. And we will explore that a little bit in the days to come. Final sort of graph that I'm showing you here is just an interesting point. Um, Often one would say, well, maybe the rate that or reason for incarceration having gone up over the years and for having a lot of people in prison is that crime just happens a lot. The reality is that, and I missed in the last 10 years here, but it would be a similar sort of pattern. Crime rates have actually been falling for about a 25, 30-year period in Canada, and yet prison populations haven't really dwindled at the same rate. Some would argue that that suggests that maybe we are overpopulated. And again, food for thought. It's something for you to consider. Final point before I give you a little bit of work to do that I'll describe in a second. Just a couple of facts about prisons, things to consider as you do your work. There are roughly, as of a few years ago, 41,000 prisoners in prisons with over 20,000 staff. Okay, and so it's actually a very expensive thing to run a prison because, of course, you can't just have prisoners. You need people within the staff to provide support, security, so on and so forth. And it can be quite a difficult and costly enterprise. They estimate in terms of cost that it's over $3 billion a year to run a prison. That's actually $110,000 on average per inmate. And when you think about the fact that the average nurse or teacher or a huge number of other public servants within the country don't make that, we're paying more for people being in prison than we are for some of the more important people within our community in terms of their social role that government would pay a salary to. And certainly that yields a question in terms of, is prison, when it costs so much, the ideal solution? Final couple of points. Prisons are often places where you have disproportionate numbers in terms of just who goes there. By far, the vast majority of people are males, often younger males. We also have a situation where oftentimes there's a lot more people who are Indigenous or Black in prison compared to people who are Caucasian or Asian. And certainly one of the questions that's often raised is that a product of a justice system that may not always be fair for everybody? And is there maybe some systemic problem in terms of the prison system in that if you maybe don't have the resources to have a good lawyer when you go through a trial, does that lead to unfair sort of imbalanced, yes, outcomes between different groups? That is a question that's often asked. Less than 5% of people in prison are female. And then last point, and this is also something worth considering, you may think that most people who go to prison commit violent crime. The reality, though, is that when you look at prisons in Canada, violent crime does make up a number of the people there, but a huge number of those people would be there for robbery, theft, or drug-related offenses that actually oftentimes don't involve any violence whatsoever, other than violence to a person's property or I guess, things, yeah, their property, things that they own. And certainly an interesting stat. Okay, I'll skip this part here. It's not too important. There's different levels of prison. We're going to look at some different examples. Do understand that obviously not everybody needs to be in the most severe maximum security, they call it, institution. Some people may actually, and they may work their way from one part to another as they sort of get closer to being released. But some people may be in more minimum or medium security type locations. And we'll look at a few of those things in some of your homework you're going to have. Okay, your work for tonight is as follows. I'd like like you to read pages 214 to 222 of the handout. So there's a handout that talks a little bit about prison in Canada. And then what I'd like you to do with that is I'd like you to read over the information, but also answer the questions on the sheet provided. When you come in for your next lesson, we'll talk about those and we'll discuss a little bit some of your views, particularly on the one case study of a prison that they have at the very end. Good luck.